So thank you very much both, and thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity to speak about issues that I find of the greatest importance, and that I think we can have, both fun with and make important intellectual contributions about. And not least, it's wonderful to be in this fantastic room. We don't have anything like this where I come from, unfortunately. We don't have the same kind of history. So before I begin, I would like to just say a few words about my relationship to Ernest Gellner, since this is a seminar in honor of Gellner's legacy. Ernest Gellner was born in Prague in 1925, died in Prague in 1995, but he spent most of his life abroad. Right? He was known mainly as an English philosopher at first, and then he got disillusioned with philosophy because he was exasperated by the fact that philosophers in Britain in the 1950s, they were mainly just interested in language, and he wanted philosophy to matter in the world, to say something about the world. So he made a move to social anthropology and did a PhD from Morocco, based on fieldwork in Morocco. The Saints of the Atlas was his monograph, and then became a professor of sociology. So he was very interdisciplinary within his area, and an incredibly sharp person. And eventually he also became professor of social anthropology at the University of Cambridge before returning to Prague after the Velvet Revolution. And I knew Ernest Gellner, and he was incredibly grateful and excited about the opportunity to return to a new country, but his old town, after the end of communism, and to contribute to build civil society and intellectual life here. So although his death came as a shock because it happened very suddenly, it seemed right that he should die in the city of his birth because he was deeply attached to it. Many of you know Gellner through his work on nationalism. And that is, his book, Nations and Nationalism, is, one of the 2 or 3 or 4 standard books about nationalism that everybody who takes the study of nationalism seriously has to read. And my lecture will in fact take as its point of departure Gellner's analysis of nationalism, but pull it into the contemporary era of the Anthropocene, of globalization and climate change. I guess that's where I'm basically going to start. Another book by Gellner that I'd like to mention at the outset is the one called Book, Plough and Sword, which is about really what he calls the big ditches in cultural history, the great transitions in cultural history. At first, for a very, very long time, we were all hunters and gatherers. Now, hunters and gatherers can mean very different things, okay? Some hunting and gathering societies were quite large, some are very small, but they did not produce, they harvested. And then there was the first big ditch, the transition to agriculture. And with it came the city, the state, and literacy. And then another big ditch was the print revolution and the rise of modernity, the great European conquests, 1492, the legacy of Columbus, and finally the Industrial Revolution. So for Gellner, there was this one big transition that he devoted much of his life to make sense of, the transition from what he calls agraria, rural society based on agriculture, to industrial, industrial society. And to him, that was the key to understand where nationalism came from, the national identity, the ability to identify with millions of people whom you will never meet, and the ability to feel emotionally attached to a world which is committed to change, which is a paradox, isn't it? Modernity is about change, and yet people have, if nationalism works, a sense of deep attachment to their place. So it's a conjuring trick to make people nationalists. And this is important for my subsequent argument. That's why I'm spending a couple of minutes talking about it here. It's a conjuring trick. What nationalism tells you is that, yes, you have been uprooted. Yes, there's a lot of change. Yes, you've moved into a city and started to work in a factory. Although your ancestors, they were all working on the land, and many of them lived in the same place for hundreds of years. And in spite of this, do not despair. You may feel alienated right now, but the nation is coming to your rescue. Because you still have your mother, your father, your family, your heimat, you know, your place of residence. It's still here, only that we've lifted it up to a higher level, because your nation is now your family. So you're at home in the nation, and it will give you the kind of emotional fulfillment that you need in an otherwise changing and volatile and unpredictable world. That's it's a very short version of what nationalism does to people according to the Gellnerian analysis. So nationalism, a modern ideology which praises tradition, which is one of the paradoxes of nationalism, isn't it? It's traditionalist. It's not traditional, it's traditionalist. It mimes and imitates and tries to reproduce a sense of continuity with the past at a time when changes are taking place very rapidly. But there's one other aspect of Gellner's theory of nationalism, which is even more important for what I'm going to say. And that is what he speaks of in Nations and Nationalism as cultural entropy. You know, entropy, which is a concept that he borrows from thermodynamics. It's about the evening out of differences, how nationalism produces from a world of many small differences, that of agraria, where every little community had their own identity, they were suspicious of the neighbors, they spoke their own dialect, they had their own food, etc. From that world to a world of a few large differences, right? So a world of many small differences was converted into a world of just a few major differences, those between the nations. Within the nation, everybody was supposed to feel the same and to have a shared sense of identity, no matter where you were from within the nation. But as a compensation, you had a sharp boundary between the nation and everything else, the other nations. In one of his more famous allegories from Nations and Nationalism, Gellner compares the transition from agraria to industrial, from the world of many small differences and little local communities to those sort of big nations where everybody is supposed to feel the same, no matter where they're from, and regardless of the fact that they don't know everybody else. He compares it with, from early 20th century art, paintings of Kokoschka. He says, we have moved from the world of Kokoschka to the world of Modigliani. You know, Kokoschka, a riot of color. That's a world of many small differences. Lots of little colors, you know. And the world of Modigliani with its calm, monochrome, large surfaces. I think that's key to begin to think about diversity in the era of the Anthropocene, which is the topic that I'm now moving quickly to, which is the work that I'm engaged in at the moment. Because I think we must all agree that in a certain sense, globalization, which is part of the same story that Gellner tells us about nationalism, only lifted up to a higher level, you might say, to global level, that globalization does lead in some ways to reduction of diversity. It certainly does lead to the removal of some of the differences to which we were accustomed in the past. And we see this in many domains. So the world from Kokoschka to Modigliani, the nation, it continues. I mean, Gellner saw this himself. You know, when I spoke to him in the early 90s about various aspects of identity politics and so on, he said to me that, you know, today people still speak different languages, but they say pretty much the same thing. Okay? That's modernity for you. It's a kind of world which the sociologist George Ritzer spoke of as the McDonaldization of society. The McDonaldization, which to him, it's a very smart book, it's an intelligent book, because it's intended for undergraduate students who haven't read Karl Marx, they haven't read Max Weber, they don't know much social theory, and he tries to sort of smuggle in, Ritzer, the insights, especially from Weber, and Weber's early 20th century theory of rationalization and bureaucracy by using McDonald's as an example, because all the students had been to McDonald's. So he says, okay, you go to a McDonald's in Japan, or in Bolivia, or in England, and it's the same. Same menu, same grammar, you just go in, you know, you make your order and place your order, and with very small regional variations. There are some tiny regional variations. In India, at McDonald's, you don't get beef burgers, okay? But you get lamb burgers. In the Muslim world, there has to be a halal, you know, guarantee, okay? All the meat is halal. But apart from this, it's the same grammar. So that's an illustration of the idea that people are they speak different languages, but they say pretty much the same thing. This is in some ways an exaggeration, but let's try to pursue that argument for a little while. Globalization and modernity is about homogenization, standardization, acceleration, homogenization, how modernity leads to the development of a shared way of talking about the world and shared consumer preferences, increased contact. We have now become so accustomed to using English as a global language that we almost forget that this is in fact what we're doing, and that there has been a homogenization. As late as in the 1930s, intellectuals in Europe, they needed to be fluent, or at least master 3 languages, apart from their own. I mean, if they were Czech or Norwegian, it would be 4, because you needed to be able to follow the French, the German, and the English speaking. Right? That was considered, I mean, it was a requirement. And then increasingly, after the Second World War, it's just English. Everything is in English. If you don't publish in English, you don't exist. That's what we are being told at my university. You know, when they speak about internationalization and international publications, they don't think about publishing in the best German journals or the French journals. No, it has to be in English. And preferably, it should be American. Okay? So I mean, it's easy to find many examples of the homogenization resulting from globalization. So one term that has been proposed as an alternative to the term Anthropocene, I'm coming to the Anthropocene in a minute, because that's one of the issues which were not, they were not in focus at the time when Gellner wrote. I mean, Gellner wrote between the late 1950s and the mid-1990s, and it was only after the 1990s that Anthropocene questions and Anthropocene effects have really caught prominence. So I'm coming to that in a little while. But before that, another way of talking about the Anthropocene is by calling it the plantationocene. Okay, that's a long and cumbersome term, the plantationocene, the world as a plantation. We can use that to speak about nature, or we could use it to speak about culture. So let's talk about culture first. The plantation removes diversity quite clearly. I mean, when you replace the rainforest with a plantation, you cut down all those trees which belong to different species, and you impoverish the soil, and everything becomes similar to everything else, right? And you replace them with soybeans or oil palms or the same species everywhere, or bananas, the same species. Okay, it's a simplification, and the people who work in the plantation are replaceable. You know, if you have worked in a plantation in Malaysia, you can easily be moved to a plantation in Peru and do the same work because it looks the same. Just as a person working at McDonald's in New Delhi can just transfer to New York City. I mean, in theory, they could, and do the same job because the job looks the same. It doesn't require any local, specific, unique knowledge that can only be had here. Everything is comparable to everything else within the plantationocene. The anthropologist Sidney Mintz, who wrote about the Caribbean and who was interested in plantation societies, he spoke of the plantation as the proto-factory. The first form of industrial mass production in the world was that developed in the plantation societies from the 16th century onwards, with replaceable labor, with standardized production, and with global supply chains. So you were part of a global economy as a plantation. So some would say that the plantation is a good metaphor, a good template for speaking about the world today. How everything becomes, you would have thought, I mean, you have thought this many times yourself, haven't you? That differences are in many ways becoming less pronounced, and we all become comparable. Everything becomes comparable to everything else. Everything can be measured using the same yardsticks, just as in the plantation. This is very much in spirit with, in line with what Ernest Gellner wrote about the Industrial Revolution, how the local handicrafts, which could only be learned by showing, which were different from village to village and certainly from country to country, how they were replaced by industrial production, which could be moved around the planet at whim. So this is quite clearly one effect of modernity. And as modernity has really taken off and become global, especially from the late 20th century, it's an effect of globalization, global modernity. And this is not without its perils, and it's not without its risks. And I'm coming to that as well. But okay, just one other example from culture before I move on to talking about biological diversity. Because I think we should look at biological diversity and cultural diversity using some of the same tools and try to see if we can develop a way of understanding the reduction of biological diversity and of cultural diversity through the same lens. Okay, so, but just one example from cultural diversity, just to illustrate. I said a world of many small differences is being turned into a world of just a few major ones. And perhaps even those differences may be disappearing. Now, there's another rather nice book by the same American sociologist, and I'd just like to mention George Ritzer, called The Globalization of Nothing. It's a great title. And what does he mean by nothing? Well, he defines nothing, in fact. So by nothing, he means non-places, non-services, non-commodities, and non-people. By this, he doesn't mean that they don't exist. He just means that they have no local character. They can be replaced by anybody else, by anybody. The typical non-place would be the airport, or the highway, or the McDonald's. The non-service would be that which is generic, standardized. I mean, he wrote before the smartphone, but you know, many of us carry these with us. The app, that which can be put into an app, is a non-service because it has no local quality, no local flavor, and it could be anywhere and could be appropriated and used by anybody. Then think about the standardizing effects of the social media, how they have led to a flattening of difference. It's mind-boggling. So, and the non-people, which is, I mean, it's a bit rude to speak about persons as non-people, but what he says is that they are only non-people while they're at work. They're those sort of generic people you don't really notice. The opposite of the globalization of nothing would be that which has a local character, which is only here, which couldn't be anywhere else, like a beach in the Seychelles. You can't outsource it because it's only there. And in order to experience that beach, you have to go there. Or it could be, I mean, it could be a restaurant with locally sourced food, which is unique, which you don't get anywhere else. Where they have, I mean, they have a chef, okay, in the kitchen who has his own way of combining different ingredients so that you know that the food that I'm getting here, I cannot get the same food anywhere else. So you see what I mean. And Ritzer's argument is that with the globalization of nothing spreading, what we are getting increasingly is a world of reduced diversity. It's easy to see this in the realm of consumption, but perhaps we can also see it elsewhere. How, for example, I mean, from my own experience, when I was a young man, you know, when I traveled to other European countries, it was sort of a major part of the trip to bring things with you home that you couldn't get at home. And now increasingly, well, apart from tourist trinkets, you don't really have to, because you can get most of what you buy abroad at home. There's been a flattening, a standardization. But to take an example which is not from consumption, on the reduction of diversity, language. I mentioned how we now use English as a sort of international language without even thinking about it, because it's become second nature to many of us. But in fact, of the 6,000 or 7,000 languages which are currently spoken in the world, it is estimated by as early as 2050, maybe 85% of them will have lost their last native speaker. Okay, most of these languages are small. You know, they would be local. They would not be part of this transition, you know, from a world of many small differences to one of major ones. They would be small, oral, non-written languages, typically in South America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, Melanesia, and so on. And they would have lost the last native speaker as early as by 2050. And this represents a loss. I mean, if there is anything to the notion that certain things can only be expressed in a particular language. As I used to say when I studied philosophy, certain thoughts can only be thought in German. And therefore, you mustn't read Hegel in translation. I must confess I did read Hegel in translation, and what was difficult about him was not necessarily the language, but that was the idea. So this debate has a long history in linguistic anthropology and also in linguistics in general. To what extent different languages, in fact, represent the world in radically different ways. At least up to a point, this argument has something going for it. So it means that if we all, or not all, but if we lose that kind of linguistic diversity, something is lost which will be hard to retrieve later on. Now to the second part of what I was going to say, namely about biodiversity, biological diversity, because it has struck me. And that's when I started to look into this, because I've been looking at homogenization and globalization for many years within the realm of culture and society and politics. But it struck me when speaking with biologists about biological diversity and the loss of biological diversity, many of them spoke pretty much along the same lines as anthropologists and others who are concerned with the loss of cultural diversity, with the flattening of culture, with the domination of certain cultural forms and certain, you might say, conceptualizations of the person. What is a good person? And how should we behave? Standardization in culture seems to be reflected in the loss of biodiversity. So they use very much the same language. I mean, when we speak about the loss of languages, for example, or the loss of local customs, biologists might speak of species extinction. You know, the loss of natural species, which are also not coming back. When they're gone, right? We have some figures which indicate that something has happened very fast in the realm of biological diversity, a reduction of biological diversity. And let me just mention a couple of examples just to illustrate the points. By today, of all the mammals alive in the world, just 4% of the total biomass is constituted by wild animals. 4%. Out of the remaining 96%, 36% of the total are human. Okay, so we are 36% of the biomass of mammals. And the remaining 60% are domesticated animals, mainly pigs and cattle. And this has happened pretty fast. Just 4% are wild. It doesn't sound like a lot, does it? And it isn't. And there's been a massive reduction since 1970. Of all birds in the world, 70% are owned by humans, mostly chickens. 70% of the birds in the world are owned by humans. So there's been a massive growth in a very short space of time in the domination of humanity in the regarding biomass. Another example is to do with wetlands, okay? You know, wetlands, marshes, bogs, those sort of nasty, useless areas that don't seem to be, I mean, very useful to anyone, at least not for human beings. You know, so wetlands have been drained at an alarming pace since around 1970. We've lost about 30% of the wetlands in the world since 1970. Because they are being used for infrastructural development, for factories, for agriculture, for human dwellings, and so on. So it seemed like a good idea to drain those wetlands, to make them useful. But it has a cost, and the cost is the loss of biodiversity, because these wetlands are ecologically very important, right? I mean, many birds breed there. There's a unique sort of flora. I mean, there are insects. There's a very complex web of relationships which is constituted by these wetlands. So now you see some indications that when we speak about the Anthropocene, the era of humanity, I mean, that's really what it means. The era in which humanity dominates the world to such an extent that some natural scientists, some geologists and others believe that we have entered a new geological era. That's fairly dramatic, new geological era. So what it means is really that wherever you go, human footprint is visible. Even if you go to places where no human has ever been, such as the Antarctic, or the interior of the Amazon rainforest, there will be traces of human activity, owing to pollution, you know, or to climate change. So that is the significance of the Anthropocene. It makes sense when we look at nature, and it makes sense when we look at culture. Nature, because of the loss of biodiversity, the standardization, species extinction, pollution, and so on. And in the realm of culture, we see a parallel development towards reduced cultural diversity. And this is what I think we need to think about, these two phenomena as one. Interconnected, one big interconnected phenomenon. And I'm going to suggest one way in which we can do that in a little while, in a couple of minutes. How can we see the loss of biodiversity and the loss of cultural diversity through the same lens? If we agree that this is taking place, and that in fact it does entail a kind of loss, which is fairly dramatic. You know, 200 years ago, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, there were just 1 billion of us, okay? It took humanity 200,000 years to reach the first billion. So at the time, we could do pretty much as we liked, and the planet would sort of recover. It would. I mean, it was simply beyond our ability to completely transform the biosphere, the ecological makeup of the planet. We were not sufficiently numerous, and we didn't have the technology. 200 years after, we are 8 billion, and now we begin to see some fairly dramatic effects of human activity. Is it the Anthropocene we're talking about? Is it humanity as such? Or is it the Plantationocene we're talking about? Which is suggested as a different term, you know? I mean, well, the plantation, the industrial mode of production is dominating, and the industrial mode of consumption. Or is it, as some left-wing social theorists suggest, the Capitalocene? It's capitalism. It's not humanity as such. It's just one sort of aspect of humanity, namely capitalism, with this relentless drive to growth and innovation and domination and expansion. Well, I'm not going to go into that conceptual discussion here. I would instead like to propose a fourth concept, okay? Yes, we can talk about the Anthropocene. Yes, obviously humanity is now dominating the world, and we've painted ourselves into a corner, and we need to find a way out of it. We've been too successful for our own good. You know, the fossil fuel revolution, it was great fun, but the party's over now. I mean, and it's gradually dawning upon us that, bloody hell, you know, we have to shift direction, otherwise things are going to look really bad very soon, and are already beginning to look very bad in some places. But it was fun as long as we lasted. Don't forget about that. It was great. Look at the lights in the ceiling here, the warmth in the room. It's smoke-free. We've got advanced technology enabling me to speak to people who are not even physically present. It's been a wonderful place to be, but we now have to somehow find a way to wriggle out of the contradictions that we have created, namely that we are destroying the conditions for our own civilization through our activities. So we're too successful for our own good. Okay, so we have that, the Anthropocene, the Capitalocene, the Plantationocene, or maybe the fourth concept that I'm suggesting, the Homogenocene. This is an era which is characterized by homogenization. And now I move quickly to the analysis. Okay, now I've tried to argue that in line, in fact, with Gellnerian cultural history, we've now come to a stage that he did not describe, namely that of the Anthropocene or the Homogenocene, where we are successively undermining the conditions of our own existence. There's a break here, right? You have these linear stories of progress, okay? Things have gone from hunting, gathering, to agriculture, the early state, the print revolution, the great conquest, technological advances, capitalism, and prosperity, and liberal democracy. And then we reach a point where that paradigm somehow has exhausted itself and has led to ecological disaster and impending global ecological catastrophe, plus a reduction in some forms of freedom because of the loss of cultural diversity. So if we agree that this is a fair description, let's move on to the next and final analytical part of this lecture. How can we best study loss of biological and cultural diversity? As many of you would have discovered, there have been many attempts in recent years to overcome the division between nature and culture, which is, I mean, it runs deep in our cultural history, in our tradition. The Cartesian divide, mind, body, culture, nature. Animals are like automata, they're like advanced machines, according to Descartes. So the Cartesian dualism between nature, culture, and mind and matter are being challenged from many directions. And not least in anthropology, but also elsewhere, there are many people who try to overcome this barrier in various ways. And I've got mine, sort of my favorite way of trying to overcome this barrier, and I think we can use this lens in order to look at both cultural diversity and biological diversity. Okay, let us consider the natural world and the world of humanity as one big system of communication. Okay, thank you. One big system of communication. That's one way of looking at nature. There's a very exciting, to me, minority view in biology, which also has supporters in various other places, called biosemiotics, inspired partly by Gregory Bateson, but also by others. Biosemiotics is a way of trying to read nature as a system of communication. Some of you would have heard about the recent interest in trees, okay? The way in which trees communicate with each other through subterranean networks of fungi and soil and roots and so on. I'm not saying that they deliberately, that they are thinking like you and me, okay? I'm not saying that. I'm only saying that they influence each other and that there is an exchange of nutrients and of what we may think of as information amongst trees. This view was quite controversial when it was first proposed by the Canadian botanist Suzanne Simard in the late 1990s, but it has now become mainstream. Everybody now seems to agree that, yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on between trees, subterranean. And we can study it by looking at this as exchange of information. So some even have gone so far as to speak of the Wood Wide Web. Okay, I would hesitate doing this, okay, but you see what I mean. And there is communication all around you in nature if you care to look for it. Relationships between plants, animals. Yeah, I mean, let me give you a couple of examples of the kind of semiosis, the communication that takes place. Well, there's the obvious communication between the grass and the herbivore, the grass and the animal grazing, the communication between the predator and the herbivore. There, obviously, there's communication. I mean, when a lion sneaks up to you and you run, something goes on in that relationship, and it can be studied as an exchange of information. Not deliberate. It's not, we're not talking about conscious purpose. Let's leave that around. Intentionality. It's not intentionality, but there is communication going on. One of the concepts from biosemiotics that I find particularly useful in this context is that of semiotic freedom. It is a relative of the term flexibility. Flexibility refers to your elbow room, that which you could do differently, the choice, the options you have. And semiotic freedom denotes some of the same things. It's a variety of options you have when you communicate with the world. We human beings have a lot of semiotic freedom because we think, we can take choices, we can do things differently. But also other species do, to varying degrees. So let me just give you one example from nature on the kind of communication that we can read out of nature without attributing human sort of characteristics or human personalities to animals. We shouldn't do that, of course. Anthropomorphism. We should steer clear of anthropomorphism. But still, think about a snake versus a dog. If a snake chases a mouse, obviously there's some communication going on there. The mouse is terrified and the snake is hungry. So it sneaks behind the mouse, but the mouse runs and it hides behind the bush. Okay, there's a bush, snake comes here, mouse runs quickly around, hides behind the bush. And it lies there very still so that the snake is unable, to hear or feel or smell it. And after a little while, the snake loses interest and it just slinks off somewhere else because it forgets, it doesn't have an image in his little head of the mouse. Now consider a dog chasing the same mouse in the same place. Okay, mouse runs around the bush, hides behind it, lies still. What does the dog do? The dog goes slowly around the bush in the opposite direction to surprise the mouse because it has an image somewhere about the mouse hiding behind some kind of memory. What I'm saying by this contrast is that the dog has a greater degree of semiotic freedom than the snake. It doesn't mean that the snake doesn't have any, it just has fewer options. So the number of options we have in communicating in the world could be described as our semiotic freedom. The freedom we have to send out and communicate through a variety of signs. Now, according to the leading biosemiotician, Jesper Hoffmeier, if you're interested, send me an email and I'll give you references, since I don't have PowerPoint, who died a couple of years ago. According to him, if there is one thing we can say about evolution in general, biological evolution, it is that there has been an increase in semiotic freedom. And I think we could say the same thing about the evolution of culture. If we want to take the very broad view, there's been an increase in semiotic freedom because think about the proliferation of languages, the number of languages that grew and grew and grew and grew until quite recently, and the diversity in social and cultural forms, which have been the, you might say, the mainstay of anthropology for more than 100 years, for 150 years, to study that diversity in cultural forms, in kinship systems, in religion, in myths, in economic activities, huge diversity. So there's been an increase in semiotic freedom, both in the realm of nature and in the realm of culture. Now, what I have suggested at the beginning of this lecture, where I started off with some reflections around Ernest Gellner's cultural history is that this may have come to an end. It may be that until the onset of the Homogenocene, I'm not going to say when, because that's a matter of debate when that started. Is it 1945 or is it 1990 or is it even the early 19th century with the Industrial Revolution? It doesn't really matter so much. But the point is that until quite recently, there was an increase in semiotic freedom in the realm of culture nature. And that has now come to an end. And what we are now experiencing is a reduction in semiotic freedom. There's less diversity. There are fewer options available. As Francis Fukuyama said after the end of the Cold War, there is now only one game in town, and that is capitalism and liberal democracy. I wouldn't say that is right. There's lots of resistance against capitalism and liberal democracy, but you can see his point. I don't think it was completely off the mark, that now capitalism and the ideas of democracy, individualism, etc., which had been dominant for a few decades, were now about to become universal. And as a result, it's hard for people in Europe to tolerate people in other parts of the world who have a completely different view of the good life, because they're against human rights. So what about human duties, obligations? You know, to some people in the world, your life is not defined through your rights, but through your duties, your obligations. You do as your parents say. You're faithful to God. You try to do your best, you know, to fulfill God's will on earth and your community. And it's not up to me to make my personal choices. That would be very selfish. That kind of attitude is much harder to defend now than it was only a generation or two ago. I mean, you see what I'm talking about? A flattening. I'm not saying that these are the wrong standards or the wrong ideas, only that there's less variation. Only a little more than a generation ago, politicians in my country, in Norway, and also elsewhere, they could praise immigrant communities from outside of Europe because they looked after their families so much better than the selfish individualist Norwegians. Look at those Pakistanis who have extended families and they come together and they look after each other. You couldn't say that now, not after the 1990s, because if you did, people would accuse you of defending enforced marriages and even female circumcision and horrible things that these non-Europeans are rumored to engage in. So the spread of human rights is also part of the homogenization, the loss of diversity, the shift from a world of many little differences to one of a few big ones. So I'm not saying that this is all bad, okay? Only saying that we are losing options and it's happening very fast, and it's happening both in the realm of culture, and I could go on about this for hours, but I won't, okay? But you can ask me questions afterwards. The way in which nature is becoming homogenized. Yeah, I have to give one more example, because I think it's a good metaphor as well. How nature is being homogenized and how we are losing options and losing flexibility and losing semiotic freedom. One example, and it can be used metaphorically, just as a plantation logic can be transferred onto to other things that we do. The plantation is a bit like McDonald's, isn't it? And it's a bit like Netflix. Yeah? You see what I mean? I mean, there's a loss of, you lose variation, and everybody, whether you're in South Korea or in Brazil, you watch the same series. Not necessarily, again, not necessarily a bad thing, but we lose options, we lose variation. So the one example that I wanted to mention towards the end is that of the Green Revolution. Again, the Green Revolution in the 1960s and 70s, it was fantastic for people in India. India, which at the time when the population of India was just 250 million, they had famines. They were not capable of feeding their own population. Then came the Green Revolution with experimentally produced, you know, in greenhouses and through cross-fertilization and so on of various cereal strains. The Green Revolution produced far more productive, mainly wheat strains, but also others, far more productive. They didn't have to grow, you know, 70 centimeters tall. They could make do with 50 centimeters, and they had larger seeds and yielded more. So through the Green Revolution, through the reduction of diversity in Indian agriculture, because that's really what happened, where one concentrated on just a few strains of wheat, you could produce far more and feed a much larger population. So now with a population of 1.2 billion, there are no, at least not necessarily, they don't need to have famines in India. It's self-sufficient in food production. But at a cost, because when you concentrate on just a few strains of wheat, which are highly productive, and you depend on very mechanized agriculture with chemical fertilizer and machinery, you lose flexibility, because if that fails, if those few strains that you depend on fail, then you have nothing, because then you've lost the flexibility you used to have when you had lots of little local varieties of wheat. So this is what I mean, that if we're playing a game at high stakes, both in the world of culture and perhaps especially in the world of biodiversity, and that there has been a loss of, until, as I said, until very recently, an increase in semiotic freedom, an increase in communicative diversity, more signs of different kinds were flowing around the world, and now increasingly we see the onset of the Homogeneocene and the reduction in semiotic freedom. So this is really what I had to say. This is, you could read this as a kind of footnote or a revision or a new chapter in the standard histories of cultural change that we read. But quite clearly, with the Anthropocene, we enter into new terrain, and we need new tools in order to make sense of it. And one of those tools would have to consist in trying to do something about the boundary that many of us have taken for granted between culture and nature. So I've made a modest proposal to that effect, and this is work in progress, so I welcome your objections and questions. So thank you for your attention so far.
Okay, just a brief note, we have colleagues here who are online also, so I'd like to encourage those who are online to raise your hands or ask your questions, write your questions to chat, and the floor is open also to you, of course. Marek, probably you'd like to start with first question. No, because nobody is here.
Yes,
yes,
please.
please. And could I just may I ask you come here and speak up just to the mic?
You're asking a lot.
Yeah. Would you?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. To the mic.
Well, I just wanted to ask, what exactly is the goal of combining nature and culture in this way? And what can we actually achieve by doing this? Because it's good to talk about how both of these things are rapidly losing individuality at comparable rates and draw parallels between that. But now that we have those parallels, what now? And how does it help us do anything about it exactly?
Yeah, thanks very much. Excellent question. Yeah, so why is it so helpful to combine, as it were, perspective on culture and nature? Well, I think one major, there are two really ways to begin to answer the question. One is that there are some striking pattern resemblances between the loss of biodiversity and the loss of cultural diversity, which haven't been properly investigated. They resemble each other. So I said, when biologists speak about species extinction, it's almost like hearing anthropologists speak about the situation for indigenous people who are being dominated by states and by invading people. And the second is that the causes of the loss of biological and cultural diversity are pretty much the same. But there are differences, which is also interesting to explore, because the temporalities are different. You know, what is happening in nature is, it is generally quite slow. Evolution is very slow, but then it's being sped up by human intervention, whereas culture is much, much faster. You know, one way of thinking about this is by thinking about the temporalities of the different sciences as the hands of a clock. Okay, you have the hour hand, which is very slow. That's the hand of geology. Okay, sediments and continental drift. Then you have the minute hand, which is a hand of biological evolution, which is faster, but still very slow. Then you have the second hand. That's the hand of history and social science. And so it's clearly these temporalities differ, but they seem to be converging now owing to human intervention. So, well, I mean, one aim is therefore to simply to try to understand what's happening in the biosphere, also to replace the term biosphere with the semiosphere. That's really one of the things I'm trying to do. To think about it as a one semiotic system. And another is that it's fairly urgent for other reasons to think about humanity as part of a larger ecology. You know, I mean, according to Bateson, who saw this very early, more than 50 years ago, one of the big epistemological errors of Western civilization is this firm boundary between us as humanity and everything else. And it's coming at us with a vengeance now, owing to environmental destruction and climate change, that we are slowly beginning to realize that that kind of separation is untenable. Now, what I like about biosemiotics is that it doesn't draw a boundary between us humans and everything else, but it also doesn't say that everything is the same. It says that there are degrees. You know? So there are degrees of semiotic freedom and degrees of the ability to communicate with the world. There is, quite obviously, what is an animal? Is it a slug or is it a chimpanzee? If you just say animal, you don't make that distinction, and I think we should. So that's a short way of beginning to answer, but it's an important question. Why should we bother? Yeah, you know, many anthropologists now speak about the anthropology of the more than human, for example. I mean, that's been a sort of thing that many speak about, and I have sympathy with that position, although I would use a different terminology. But it's something which is sort of, to many, I mean, urgently, it's pressing itself upon us, also because we notice the way in which our relationship with that which is not human, it's not trivial, it's important, and it was neglected. Think about anthropology, the anthropos of anthropology, the humanities, okay? It's about human existence. Social sciences, about social relationships between humans. What we may want to take seriously now is the need to expand that, to include everything that we relate to. This is a dead object, but still, you know, that we think more relationally and not just about that which goes on between humans.
Okay. We have a question from Petr Skalník here, who's one of the co-founders of the Gellner Semináře. Hello, Petr. If I may to read it, Thomas, greetings and thanks for your thoughts. Right here. How do you see worldwide epidemics as integral part of Anthropocene?
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Peter. That's the great question as always, and it's I can't see you, but it's good to know that you're here, even if only virtually. Well, yes, I mean these epidemics. I mean zoonosis. Which also, I mean, are a reminder of the fact that drawing sharp boundaries between humans and everything else gives us an understanding of some things, but it's also quite limiting, because the zoonosis, these pandemics, we've only seen one so far, there may be more in the near future, are results of the overheated, overcrowded, overexploited world. So paradoxically, because we have reduced the number of wild animals, those which are left come into much closer contact with us than they did before. You know, that's part of the story, part of the cause of the zoonosis. That's because they've lost their habitat. It's not because of hunting or poisoning of wild animals that they disappear, but because of habitat loss. So they are forced into closer contact with humans. I remember, I mean, during fieldwork in Australia some years ago, I got to know some people who lived in a caravan park. So they were sort of, I mean, they were struggling working class people, okay, who lived in a caravan park, in caravans. And they were quite near a sort of a former natural reserve, which had been turned into farmland, and it had been turned into grazing land for cattle. In the last couple of years, they said, that caravan park was increasingly invaded by wild animals, kangaroos hopping around, you know, and snakes and bats and so on. So that's I guess that's part of the story. But it also reminds us that there's no sharp boundary between us and everything else. Why is it that people in the Amazon have been so worried about COVID-19? Well, because they know that they have less resistance to various viruses than Europeans, because they have lived more in isolation, less contact with domesticated animals. That's why we survived, and they didn't after the conquest of the Americas in 1492. So when maybe 90% died because of less contact with domesticated animals. So in other words, our cultural and even biological past is intimately related to the past of the history of our domesticated animals. We domesticated them, and we share viruses and bacteria with them. So yes, I think that's a chapter. It's probably going to be a chapter when I get down to writing about this, about zoonosis and pandemics. And another thing about the pandemic is that, talking about Homogeneous and globalization, I'm sure it has struck you as well that at the outset of the pandemic, it was striking how similarly people reacted everywhere in the world. You know, face masks, okay? No more handshakes. Greeting people with your elbow, social distancing, quarantines, closed airports and boundaries. It happened from Bolivia to Nepal, from the Czech Republic to Norway. We saw many of the same ways of responding. So it was probably the most global event in human history. Hardly anybody was unaffected by the pandemic. There's 8 billion of us. And in Highland New Guinea, you'd find people who've never heard of the President of the United States. They've never been on YouTube, but they've heard about COVID-19. I mean, what they've heard about it is a different story. And they have ideas about the vaccine. So it's a truly global, thing. But I mean, the short answer, Petri, is that we've been brought closer together, owing to the fact that there's less space, habitat loss, and paradoxically, the reduction in wild animals has brought those which are left closer to humans.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Peter. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sophia, and I just wanted to more ask your opinion on something that I thought of when you were speaking, and in terms of the communication and like receiving nature and studying nature with lesser boundary between it with the culture, and in terms of also like connecting it to the decreasing diversity and decreasing semiotic freedom.
Yeah.
How much, like, we can find answers in the present, but shouldn't there be also answers in the past in terms of that this division between nature and culture was made by us? It is an idea that we have invented. But in terms of diversity, there are places and there are cultures who have for a longer time did not make this division. So like what I'm like thinking about of the possibility of them already having the knowledge of what are the patterns there, and us being able to kind of like share and maybe learn that knowledge from history and from anthropology.
Great comment and question. Thanks so much. Yes. Thank you very much. I'd like to say sort of two things about this. One is that we have to be critical of ourselves. I mean, we mustn't take things for granted. We mustn't take these sort of simple narratives. I've drawn out up a very big and simplified picture now. So we have to be more nuanced, and we have to give ourselves a bit of resistance. Okay, otherwise we're not getting close to the world as it is. So for one thing, yeah, is there a reduced diversity? I mean, many people speak about increased diversity because of species migration, for example. I mean, that's another parallel, invasive species, you know, and the super diversity that we see in European and other cities, for example, which may lead to greater diversity. And I said super diversity. Well, I've been working with some of that myself, and I have close colleagues who work with the idea of super diversity, saying that in fact in cities there is increased diversity now because of migration, hybridization, the meeting of cultures, the exchange of impulses, which generates new cultural forms. To this, I would give the short answer that yes, this is true. And I would quote Clifford Geertz, who wrote in 1984 in his article Anti-Relativism that, yes, of course, cultural diversity will continue to exist. The French will never eat salted butter. But the good old days of widow burning and cannibalism are gone forever. So in other words, there is diversity and there's diversity. We have to be specific. So what he says is that superficial differences will exist. But the deep differences, you know, to do with how you see the world and how you live in the world are not coming back. But, and that's also important, there is resistance, and there are pockets of isolation, or people who somehow manage to keep these homogenizing tendencies at bay, such as many indigenous peoples, and who represent a different take, a different set of knowledge, a different cosmology, a different worldview. And you might even say that they live in a different world from what you and I do, who have grown up with the, you know, within the parameters of modernity, with a sharp division between nature and culture, and we translate nature into resources, and you calculate how much they're worth. This tree is worth, you know, 100 euros. That other tree, which is a bit larger, is worth 200 euros. We don't think along those lines. So that's another important part of the story. Where is the resistance and where are the alternative visions? And one cause for anxiety, I guess, is the fact that some of these alternative visions are disappearing, but they're still there. So in anthropology, there are many in recent years who have described other ways of being in the world where there is no sharp boundary between, as it were, nature and culture. I mean, so you have, I mean, for example, Philippe Descola, a great French anthropologist, wrote a book some years ago, which I think in English is called Beyond Nature and Culture, Par-delà nature culture in French, where he says that in fact there are 4 distinct ways of articulating, as it were, the relationship between humans and everything else. And 4 different, and very different, not just 1, not just 2. But if I go a little bit further back, very briefly, one very simple way of putting it is by looking at the way in which hunter-gatherers in Central Africa, according to their ethnographer, Claude Meyassou, in the 1960s, saw their relationship to the surrounding world. If you're a hunter-gatherer, you have to sort of play along with nature's whims because you rely on your ecological surroundings for your survival. You harvest honey, you pick berries, you hunt for meat, and you're part of it. So they saw nature as a subject, just like themselves. Nature is animated. Whereas the moment you become a farmer, nature becomes an enemy. Because nature to them, to farmers in Central Africa, is tantamount to termites, baboons, elephants that destroy your crops and that invade you. So you have to build a fence between yourself and nature. And then nature becomes an object to be feared and to be exploited. So that's, I mean, that could be one way of beginning. So, so here is also a role for intellectuals and academics as cultural critics. Not saying that we should revert to a hunting gathering mode of life. It's not realistic and it's not desirable. It's not possible and we don't want to. But maybe we can learn something from others. And hasn't that been one of the virtues of anthropology for more than 100 years? That we try to develop theory, not just by talking with other intellectuals, but also by, in fact, engaging seriously with other people's life worlds. It certainly is worthwhile. And there is a book, which I rather like, which tries to find lessons for the Anthropocene from traditional societies by Joy Hendry. I can't remember the title of the book, Joy Hendry, but it's about this. It's about learning from indigenous peoples. This one at the back.
Thank you for your lecture. I wanted to ask, talking about the communication between people and homogenization of the language, which I wanted to say that maybe it actually helps us to communicate, right? Because maybe we have less of the languages and ways to speak, but at the same time, maybe before we had thousands of different peoples with different languages, but they had very little ways of communicating between each other and sharing those ideas.
Yep.
While now, like, biodiversity is a very bad thing that we're losing, but like in the sense of culture, we now have the way to share those ideas, even not just the highest class of intellectuals, but even the like regular workers. Even when it comes to Netflix, what you said, yes, we might all be watching same shows, but all the shows are not coming from one place, but you know, the 1 inch of subtitles connecting us. So,
yes, and we watch them in different ways as well. So you understand and you notice different things. Yes, it's another great objection. And again, keep in mind that what I've been saying, what I've been trying to do now is just to paint the big canvas, and then we have to sort of fill in the details, and we have to do that empirically. And sometimes things are not quite what they seem. If I start with biology, sometimes the introduction of new species leads to an enriching of existing ecosystems because they find vacant niches and create more complexity rather than less. Although sometimes foreign species, you know, they lead to less diversity, but that's an empirical question. But and when it comes to language, yes, I mean, okay, suppose we all speak English, but we speak it in such different ways that it conveys great diversity, and we can still understand each other, right? That's some of what you're saying, and I'm thinking about authors like Salman Rushdie, for example, or Amitav Ghosh, who's also a novelist of Indian origin, but who lives in England and who's an anthropologist. Okay, he has a PhD in anthropology, but he writes novels. And they mix, languages. You have suddenly Arabic words, you have Hindi words in English. Or if you read a Nigerian novelist writing in English, you can feel sort of the rhythm and the flavor of the West African life in the language that you can understand. Whereas had he written in Yoruba, it wouldn't have been accessible to us. So that's one of the fantastic achievements of modernity, isn't it? That it enables global conversation, right? But the question is, at what cost? So by all means, that's part of the story as well. The rewards of homogenization are to do with the ability to speak with each other and to understand each other, even if it leads to less diversity. Yeah. Yes.
Hello, I have a bit of a specific question. There was a large initiative in the Czech Republic, which was about reshaping the forests of Czech Republic to be their original form. There was a lot of spruces and which were planted because it was easy to grow wood and it was used for industry. And now there's an initiative from the state to go back and use the original trees. So with the nature parallel, would something like this be possible from the state in the terms of culture?
Yep.
And, yes.
Great, thanks, great question again. Yes, I mean, one of the cases that I'm working with or taking notes about right now is, in fact, all of these rewilding projects that we see, not only in Europe, but also elsewhere, where there is an increased awareness of the loss of diversity and attempts, some of them state-supported and some of them supported by the European Union, to reinstate some of the lost diversity. For example, by introducing animal species which have lived somewhere but have gone extinct, and by planting trees to try to recreate a diversity which was there before and which has now been lost. So the question is, can we think of something similar in the realm of culture? I'm not sure. Yeah, maybe. Well, if we leave each other alone a little bit more and stop meddling and interfering with what everybody does, maybe. But you know, some of the forms of diversity that do exist in the realm of culture are seen as deeply problematic and objectionable by people in our part of the world, such as the Taliban, you know, which represent, you know, a real attempt to withdraw from modernity and to produce something on their own terms, which is local and which is ours and which is not a result of imperialism and interference from outside and so on. So there's no simple moral story here. You know, when it comes to culture, yes, I can think of one example, very quick example of something that resembles rewilding. In the Seychelles, in the Indian Ocean, because of the pandemic, the price of food went up quite steeply. Suddenly the food cost 25% more than it used to. And lots of people have been laid off because it's a touristy place, you know, and no tourists were coming. So they were struggling economically. But suddenly they had a lot of time because they didn't have a job to go to. And the food had become very expensive. Owing to homogenization, by the way. Because instead of growing lots of food plants and food crops in the Seychelles, it was cheaper to get them from plantations in Tanzania or in India. So even mangoes and bananas, we got them from other countries, which you could perfectly well grow on your own. Now, as a result of the pandemic, the rising food prices, and the fact that people had lots of slow time on their hands, they started a project called the Creole Garden, the Jardin Creole, where they try to recreate and recover skills and knowledge that had been lost about food stuffs that you could easily grow in your little plot of land, which goes together with which, you know, which herbs should you grow if you have a mango tree or you know, an avocado tree, etc., and to boost local food production. So this Creole Garden initiative simultaneously tried to recreate some biological diversity, which had been lost owing to standardization and homogenization, and cultural skills, which had also been lost, which had developed during slavery. But I'm sure there are other, I can't think of any right now, but I'm sure there are other examples. So this is the kind of thing that I think we should be working with. So what I'm saying is really that, I mean, one sort of great challenge for those of us who are interested in understanding the world today, and in the spirit, I think, of the sort of Ernest Gellner grand view of planetary and you know, the cultural history on a global scale, is to problematize the culture-nature boundary and to try to come to terms with the fact that the modernity has now entered into a new phase, which is less optimistic and more grim and more problematic than what we used to see in the past. And that this is something we need to understand and find a way of coming to terms with. And perhaps diversity is a key term here. That's really, yes, please.
I would like to ask, when you say you've been looking into the, let's say, biological approaches and disciplines, looking at diversity and homogenization, did you come across examples where, you know, an ecosystem or, you know, some animals which went in the direction of homogenization, then suddenly at some point turned, and maybe after some crisis, again started to diversify? Let's say, you know, if there's a strike of locusts or something like that, which is extremely homogeneous, and then at some point dies out. So kind of thinking about or having a hypothesis that this is kind of, let's say, a cyclical, you know, kind of a cycle where you go back and forth, homogenization, diversification, and maybe it's the way that, you know, a lot of systems in nature works, maybe humanity being part of that is on that same path.
Yeah. It's a nice. Thank you. It's a nice thought. It's a good idea. Well, I think we need to observe this over a longer period of time in order to see whether or not it happens. You know, one way of thinking about the Homogenocene is by starting in 1492. With the conquest of the Americas and the beginning spread of various foodstuffs, especially across the world, so that you've got cattle in Argentina, you've got cocoa in West Africa, coffee in South America. The staple crop for most people living in Eastern and Southern Africa now is maize, you know, corn, which is, you know, North American. So it was introduced during colonialism quite recently, and has in the space of a very short time become the staple crop. For a very long time, the spread of especially food crops and domesticated animals across the planet was an attempt, you know, to help people survive and to help people make a living. So you had all of this space, the pampas in South America, in Argentina, seemed perfect, you know, for cattle. So cattle was introduced there. You had botanical gardens in tropical places like Mauritius, one of the first botanical gardens in the tropics, dating back to the mid-18th century, where they experimented with various food crops and palms and other plants to see which would thrive and which would easily grow in Mauritius. Sugarcane was introduced from Java. So the initial impulse was not to reduce, I mean, it was never an intention to reduce homogeneity, but rather to contribute to economic growth and to people's well-being. And then we've reached a point where it seems to be, we've reached a point of counterproductivity, where there's a law of diminishing returns. We get less in return, and we've lost flexibility. And what I'm trying to say is that what started as a benign process and a benign project intended to improve life and certainly to create wealth for a few people who are lucky enough to be wealthy, has somehow flipped into something different, which is more threatening. So in Australia, for example, I mean, there are people who argue that, in fact, anything that wasn't here at the time of the first fleet in 1788 shouldn't have been here. Does that mean that they don't want apple trees or sheep? It's not an easy argument to make. But I mean, you know, my answer is that in order for your sort of thoughts to be explored, we need quite a bit of time. And I haven't seen that quite yet. Not at the moment. The main tendency now is towards more homogenization. Yes.
I was just wondering, thank you for this talk. It was very interesting, and I was wondering, so I came from a little city in Siberia, and I can say that many anti-globalization tendencies can be politicized and can be abused in political sense. So I was just wondering, yes, is there something at all we can do so it doesn't happen? So you already mentioned Taliban. And so the diversity, the idea of cultural diversity can be sometimes very politicized and abused in some populistic and nationalistic ways of thinking.
Yes. And
I have one more question about medical diversity, that there are attempts to increase medical diversity. So we have as more data from different parts of the world. So this medicine and healthcare can be as universal and as applicable as it can be. So I was just wondering about your opinion about diversity in the medical sense of science.
Medical?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't think, thank you very much. I can comment on the first part of the question. The second part I'm a bit more unsure of, but it's a very valid one. It's very valid. If we defend diversity, cultural diversity, how can we be sure that these ideas are not being appropriated by insidious political forces, that seek withdrawal, which are anti-modern, which are anti-humanist in many ways, and which promote an idea of tradition, which is actually quite authoritarian, and which leaves people with few choices. We've seen this happen before. In Southeast Asia, when they spoke about Asian values, as a kind of antidote to Western democracy, and Asian values is about, just following the leader. In Kenya, the late dictator Daniel Arap Moi spoke about Nyonyo, which is, I think it was Nyonyo, which is footsteps. Follow my footsteps. I'm the chief. I'm the boss, and that's how we do it here in Africa. And don't come here and talk about human rights, because that's an imperialist Western import. That's nothing to do with us. Apartheid in South Africa was inspired by anthropological thinking. The architect behind apartheid, which was about difference, which was apartness. Apartheid in Afrikaans means apartness. We, different ethnic groups, are so different that we should be kept apart, segregated. Otherwise, we're going to be so alienated and unhappy and confused. And the architects behind apartheid, some of them were anthropologists. Werner Eiselen at the University of Stellenbosch was one of the main sort of theories behind apartheid. So we should be wary of this. There's a thin line between progressive green politics, to take that, progressive indigenous politics, and ethno-fascism and eco-fascism. Which makes it ever more challenging, because, why am I engaged in this? Why am I so interested? Because I think that there's something important at stake for the future of humanity and the future of the planet, and that we need to come to terms with it in a constructive way. But what you mentioned, and what several others have mentioned here, about the wonderful spread of a common language of communication, enabling us to communicate globally, which is fantastic. We can have a global conversation because we now understand each other better. And what you're saying, that ideas of the local diversity, romanticizing of the local and so on, it can very easily be misused as a tool of exclusion and withdrawal. So the conversation continues. I just wanted, what I wanted to do is to raise the question and to say that this is something that anthropologists and others should be looking at. And if we're beginning to, I think, an hour and a half is usually enough, but I'd be happy to answer more questions. But if we begin to conclude a bit, when a friend of mine who's a philosopher, and he studied with Habermas in Frankfurt and took a PhD there. And before that, he studied at the University of Oslo. And he says that in his 10 years as a student, first as an undergraduate, postgraduate, and then as a PhD student, nobody ever spoke about nature. It wasn't on the agenda. It was not part of the repertoire or our relationship with ecology. Everything was about human rights, deliberative democracy, what is it to be human, phenomenology, and so on. So I think that we are now in the middle of perhaps I shouldn't say intellectual revolution, but something is changing. Suddenly, it's become almost impossible not to think about the implications of what human beings are doing to the planet when we think about humanity. Another friend of mine, the author Jostein Gaarder, who wrote a rather popular book called Sophie's World 30 years ago, which is a novel about the history of philosophy for young people, big bestseller at the time. And he said that, 30 years ago, when I wrote Sophie's World, it hadn't occurred to me that I should say anything at all about nature or ecology or the way in which we relate, to animals, to the wider ecosphere and to the rights of future generations. It hadn't struck him. And now it would have been unthinkable to write a novel about the history of philosophy or about philosophy without at least touching upon these issues. So something is happening, and we're now busy trying to reorient ourselves and trying to sort of reshape our intellectual toolbox in order to come to terms with that as well. And for me, one of the best alternatives I've come across, and which I think we can tweak in the directions that I've been suggesting, is biosemiotics. One version or other of semiotic way of reading communication. But I'd be happy to answer more questions. I'm not exhausted yet, but maybe you are. Ah, this one.
Sorry, this is the very last question.
Okay. Okay, Marek. Yeah.
Hello, first of all, thank you for the seminar. I wanted to ask, you said that we are in the middle of transition between many small differences to the few big differences. I would like to ask, what do you think? Can anthropologists help government, society, people to handle it? Or can do something with it? Or is it our goal, or one of the goals of anthropologists today?
Yeah, well, you know, it's a great question. I mean, anthropology, Ulf Hannes once said that anthropology, if we want to define what it is the study of human diversity. And yeah, I mean, that's a good place to start. It's a study of human diversity, where we emphasize that, in fact, we human beings, we can lead very different lives. Or as someone else said, we are born, we are born with the capability of only living one life. But we could have lived thousands of them, 1,000 different lives, but we end up having lived just one. But through anthropology and through fiction and through other means, we can understand and vicariously live and identify with many of these other lives. So I think one of our jobs is to keep the options open, really, as anthropologists, by showing that there are different solutions to the challenges of living. And by implication, if someone wants to take some of these insights or ideas and use them and say, look, here's something we can learn, we can use these in order to solve some problems or to think differently about the meaning of life or why we're here, that would be great. Yeah. So I think that would be, that's one way of thinking of it. I think that is our job, is to discuss human diversity. But then, when we do that, we mustn't forget that we human beings also have a lot in common, which has been often neglected by anthropologists in the 20th century. There's been an obsession with diversity at the expense of not thinking enough about what we have in common.